In 1502, a Portuguese cartographer made a mistake that could have cost him his life, not because he drew a map incorrectly, because he drew one at all. The document he produced, a detailed chart of the South American coastline, of trade winds and harbor depths, was not meant to exist outside the walls of the Casa da Índia in Lisbon. Maps of this kind were classified instruments of the Portuguese crown. Copying one without authorization was treated as an act of treason. Sharing one with a foreign agent carried the same weight as handing an enemy an army. We tend to think of maps as tools, neutral objects, a way of getting from here to there. But for most of recorded history, a map was not a tool. It was a weapon. And like all weapons, governments decided very carefully who was allowed to hold one. What exactly did a map contain that made it worth protecting with the same ferocity as a military fortress? To understand why maps became dangerous, we have to go back to the moment they became meaningful. The oldest surviving map is not a chart of continents or coastlines. It is a small clay tablet, fired in ancient Babylon sometime around 600 BCE, depicting the known world as a flat disk surrounded by ocean. Babylon sits at the center. The rivers, the Euphrates, the Tigris, flow outward like veins, and at the edges of the disk, beyond the known world, the tablet notes only the places where the sun is not seen. This was not a navigational tool, it was a cosmological statement. To place yourself at the center of a map was to place yourself at the center of creation. Babylon did not just happen to be in the middle of that tablet. It was drawn there deliberately because the map was not describing geography, it was describing authority. The Egyptians understood this deeply. Their administrative maps, used to record land parcels along the Nile after each annual flood, were instruments of taxation and state control. To be mapped was to be counted. To be counted was to owe. The map was the mechanism by which the pharaoh's abstract claim over the land became something concrete and enforceable. In early China, the relationship between maps and power was even more explicit. The Shanhai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, compiled over several centuries beginning perhaps as early as the 4th century BCE, was not simply a geographical record. It was a ritual document. It catalogued sacred mountains, rivers, and the strange creatures said to inhabit distant lands. To hold such a document was to hold, in some symbolic sense, the landscape it described. By the Han Dynasty, imperial cartography had become a formal state enterprise. Maps were kept in government archives. They were produced by officials, not travelers, and crucially, they were not circulated. A provincial governor might receive a map of his own territory. He would not receive a map of his neighbors. The logic was simple, and it was ancient. He who knows the shape of the land can move through it unseen. He who knows only his own corner of the world cannot. But the real danger of maps was not that they revealed where things were, it was that they revealed what those things were worth. Consider what it means in practical terms to possess accurate geographic knowledge in the ancient world. You know where the mountain passes are, and therefore where an army cannot go. You know the depth of a river at its narrowest ford, and therefore where it can be crossed. You know which roads are paved, which are seasonal, which connect the supply depots to the frontier. You know, in other words, not just the shape of the land, but its vulnerabilities. The Romans grasped this with characteristic precision. The Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of what scholars believe was a Roman road map from the imperial period, stretches nearly 7 meters in length and charts the roads, cities, rivers, and resting stations of an empire spanning from Britain to India. It is not drawn to scale in any meaningful geographic sense. The land masses are compressed, distorted, stretched into horizontal bands. What it preserves with extraordinary care is connectivity. Which roads go where, how long each segment takes, where water and shelter can be found. This was not a document for curious travelers. It was a logistical instrument for moving armies. The Roman military's ability to project force across a continent depended on precisely this kind of knowledge. A legion could march from Rome to the Rhine in roughly 40 days, not because Roman soldiers were exceptional, but because Roman administrators knew the route intimately, every river crossing, every provisioning station, every secondary path when the primary road was washed out. In China, the same principle held. The great cartographic tradition that culminated in Pei Shu's 3rd century treatise on map-making, establishing a grid system, a consistent scale, principles of elevation and distance, was not an academic achievement. It was a military and administrative achievement. The ability to govern a territory the size of China required knowing what that territory looked like, not in the abstract, in precise, measurable terms. And this is where the pattern begins to clarify itself. Knowledge of geography flowed upward. Generals had it. Emperors had it. Administrators with specific responsibilities had it. The people who actually lived in the landscapes being mapped, they rarely saw the documents that described their world. The question that historians have never fully resolved is whether this was an accident of logistics or a deliberate structure of power. By the 15th century, the stakes had changed entirely. It was no longer about moving armies across known territory. It was about discovering territory that no European power had yet claimed. And in that context, a map was not just a military asset, it was an economic one, worth potentially more than any single military campaign. The Portuguese had been probing the African coastline since the 1920s, edging southward decade by decade under the patronage of Prince Henry and later successive kings. Each expedition returned with something more valuable than gold or spices. It returned with knowledge, the precise shape of a cape, the location of a current, the depth of an anchorage, the wind patterns that would carry a ship around the bottom of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. This knowledge was gathered systematically, recorded meticulously, and then locked away. The Portuguese crown maintained what was effectively a state cartographic office. Pilots and navigators were required to submit their charts on return. They were forbidden, under penalty of death in some periods, from sharing geographic information with foreign nationals. The Portolan charts, the detailed navigational documents that had been circulating across the Mediterranean since the 13th century, became, in Portuguese hands, instruments of state secrecy. When Bartolomé Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, the knowledge of that passage was classified. It was held by the Crown. Other European powers did not know it happened for years. Spain was doing the same. After Columbus returned in 1493, the Spanish Casa de Contratación in Seville became the custodian of all geographic information related to the New World. A master chart, the Padrón Real, was maintained and updated as new voyages returned. Pilots were legally required to report any corrections or new discoveries. And the master chart itself was never published, never circulated. It was the property of the Crown. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal along a line in the Atlantic, was not just a political agreement, it was a geographic one. It was only possible because both powers already possessed maps that other European states had not seen. They were negotiating over a world that, officially, did not yet exist. Then came the leaks. Maps were copied. Cartographers were bribed. Portuguese and Spanish pilots who had fallen out of favor sold their knowledge to Dutch, French, and English agents. An entire shadow market in geographic intelligence developed across European capitals. The Italian merchant communities of Lisbon and Seville became clearinghouses for information that was officially secret but practically impossible to contain. And somewhere in this world of stolen maps and traded secrets, a document appeared that no one has ever fully explained. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Pirireis completed a world map. This alone was not unusual. European and Ottoman cartographers had been producing world maps for decades. What was unusual was what the map contained and what Pirireis wrote in the margins to explain it. The map, now held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, depicts the Atlantic Ocean with considerable accuracy. The coastlines of Europe and Africa are rendered with care. The eastern coast of what appears to be South America is shown, plausibly given that Portuguese expeditions had already charted significant portions of it. But in the annotations that surround the map, Pirireis describes his sources. He claims to have consulted roughly 20 older maps, including Arab charts, Portuguese navigational documents, and, the detail that has fascinated historians for a century, a map that he says was drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. Scholars have debated the Pirireis map extensively. Some of the southward land masses it depicts have been interpreted, controversially, as representing Antarctica before its official European discovery in the 19th century. Most cartographic historians treat this interpretation with significant skepticism. The distortions and uncertainties in the map make such claims very difficult to sustain. What the map does reveal, beyond any dispute, is the extent of the informal cartographic exchange happening across cultures and empires in the early 16th century. Pirireis was not working from Portuguese state archives. He was working from captured documents, traded charts, and a network of geographic information that moved beneath the official level of European state secrecy. The map is evidence that the knowledge empires were trying to contain was already moving freely, just not through official channels. This was the fundamental paradox of geographic secrecy. The information was too valuable to share openly, but it was also too valuable for individual actors, pilots, merchants, rival officials, to resist trading privately. The more fiercely states tried to contain geographic knowledge, the more elaborate and lucrative the black market in maps became. By the mid-16th century, the Flemish cartographer Gerard Mercator had synthesized enough of this circulating knowledge to produce his famous projection of the globe, a mathematical framework that allowed navigators for the first time to draw a straight line on a flat map and follow it accurately across the ocean. The Mercator projection was not a secret. It was published, distributed, sold, and within a generation it had transformed global navigation. But Mercator's achievement was only possible because decades of secretly guarded Portuguese and Spanish cartographic knowledge had gradually, inevitably leaked into the wider world. The information that empires had treated as their most closely guarded strategic asset had become a textbook. Step back from the specific histories for a moment. Look at the pattern that runs through all of them. In Babylon, a clay tablet placed one city at the center of the known world, not because it was geographically central, but because it was politically dominant. In Han China, maps of the empire flowed upward through the bureaucracy and never circulated downward to the populations being governed. In Lisbon and Seville, the greatest geographic discoveries of the age were classified as state secrets for decades. Across every one of these contexts, the relationship between maps and power followed the same logic. Maps were not simply records of what existed, they were arguments about what mattered, and whoever constructed the argument controlled the terms of every subsequent debate. A map that places your capital at the center of the world tells every reader before a single word is spoken that your civilization is the reference point for everything else. A map that shows the trade routes your empire controls makes those routes look natural, permanent, inevitable, rather than the product of specific historical choices and specific applications of force. A map that simply omits the lands beyond your frontier does not suggest that those lands are unknown. It suggests, subtly, that they do not fully exist. The philosopher J.B. Harley, one of the most important scholars in the history of cartography, argued that maps are never neutral. They are always, in some sense, rhetorical. They make claims, they prioritize, they silence. The blank spaces on a map are not simply areas of ignorance. They are, often, areas that someone decided were not worth depicting, or that someone decided were better left undepicted. The medieval European mappamundi, the great world maps that placed Jerusalem at the center, surrounded by the known continents, with the monsters and wonders of distant lands arranged at the margins, were not failed attempts at geographic accuracy. They were successful attempts at something else entirely, at representing a theological and political order in geographic form. The map was not trying to tell you where things were. It was trying to tell you what things meant. And when that kind of power, the power to define the world's meaning, not merely its shape, is concentrated in the hands of states, empires, or institutions, the withholding of geographic knowledge becomes something more than military strategy. It becomes the architecture of reality itself. For centuries, the shape of the world was a possession, not something to be discovered, something to be held. When a king's cartographers drew the edge of the known world, they were not describing a limit of human knowledge. They were drawing a boundary of permitted knowledge. The lands beyond that line were not uncharted because no one had reached them. Sometimes they were uncharted because it was useful to the people who drew the map to leave them that way. The empires of Lisbon and Seville did not protect their charts because the information was dangerous in self. They protected them because knowledge of where things are is always, quietly, knowledge of where power lies. A population that cannot read the map cannot question the road they are told to walk. And when the map is drawn by those in authority, the road always seems to lead exactly where authority intended. Humanity was not kept in geographic ignorance because the world was too complex to understand. It was kept ignorant because a world that could be fully understood by anyone could be fully questioned by anyone. That is why in every great empire you will find the same document, not a weapon, not a treasury record, a map, and beside it, always, the name of the person who decided who was allowed to see it.